Reflex is an involuntary and predictable response to stimulus. While most reflexes involve the brain, but some only use the spinal cord. The reflex is an automatic response to a stimulus that does not receive or need conscious, though as it occurs through a reflex arc. Reflex arcs act on an impulse before that impulse reaches the brain.
I can feel the pain. 잘 자, baby, 자기 여보. Bitch, 나는 solo.
Now, I will explain about the result for experiment 6.1, swallowing reflex. So for action number 1, when he swallowed the saliva without water, then the result is he will have difficulties to swallow the saliva for the second time. And for action number 2, when he swallowed the saliva with water, then he will have no difficulties to swallow the saliva for the second time. Next, I will explain about the question for experiment 6.1, swallowing reflex. So for question number 1, why is it difficult to swallow our saliva in rapid succession? Is swallowing a completely voluntary action? So the answer is this is because when the saliva is swallowed for the first time, it acts as a stimulant in the mouth cavity. At the same time, there is no more saliva and no more stimuli when we swallow the saliva for the first time. Therefore, it takes time for the salivary gland to produce enough saliva to act as a stimuli in order for the swallowing reflex to occur. In the case of voluntary action, swallowing saliva is half voluntary and half involuntary, whereas the oral phase is the voluntary action, and the pharyngeal and the esophageal phases are mediated by swallowing reflex, which is the involuntary action. For question number 2, explain the ability to swallow in rapid succession when drinking water compared to just swallowing the saliva in your mouth cavity. So the answer is, when drinking water, swallowing the saliva is easier because the water itself will act as a stimulus to replace the saliva in our mouth cavity, in order to stimulate muscle contraction of the esophagus, which is peristalsis, to swallow.
For the result of experiment 6.2, as you can see in the table here, the time lapse between the experimenter's time and the subject's time decreases over time. This is because as the trial increases, the subject becomes more focused. Moving on is for the question of experiment 6.2. The question is there any evidence that the subject improves with practice? Well, yes, there is evidence that the subject does improve with practice, which is, as the trials of experiment increases, the difference of time lapse between both experimenter and subject decreases. One, two, three.
This is the result for experiment 6.3, reaction times to touch. The table shown is the time lapse between the experimenter and the subject. As you can see over the trials, the time lapse is decreasing, but in trial 6, there's a little distractions because the subject is not focused at that time. And the average reaction time of the subject to touch is 0.18 seconds. The table for analysis and reaction time results, the length nerve pathway between the foot and the finger of the subject is 2.97 meter, and the speed in pulse transmission is 16.5 meter per second.
There's 3 questions for experiment 6.3. The first one, is the subject's reaction time longer in experiment 6.3 compared to experiment 6.2? If so, why? So the answer is yes, the subject's reaction is longer in experiment 6.3 than 6.2. This is because the nerve pathway of experiment 6.3 is a lot longer compared to the nerve pathway in experiment 6.2. The nerve pathway for experiment 6.3, which is the reaction time to touch, consists of nerve pathway from the subject's leg to the brain and transmitted to the hands for reflex. In contrast, for experiment 6.2, the nerve pathway of reactions of sight consists from the brain to the eyes and transmitted to the hand reflex. For question number 2, which of the reflexes that you have investigated are spinal reflexes and which are cerebral? And explain your answer. So the answer is the spinal reflex is the reaction of swallowing the saliva because the information is sent directly to the spinal cord without being processed by the brain. And the cerebral reflexes are the reaction time to touch and the reaction time to sight because the information is being processed by the brain. The last question, question number 3. What other reflexes are shown by humans? What parts of CNS, spinal or cerebral are involved in each case? So here I have 3 examples of spinal reflexes, which is knee-jerk reflex, gag reflex and corneal reflex, and 2 cerebral reflexes, which is yawn reflex and answering phone call.